Thanks for the question. So I would start by arguing that the most obvious contagion risk is on other developers for a number of reasons we can explore later. Contagion on banks is more limited because there's been a long-standing regulatory force to avoid excessive exposure by Chinese banks on the real estate sector, especially developers. So that's why the contagion for banks is more limited, but I have to say is very concentrated on smaller banks, which had, in a way, the courage to lend to developers because they needed higher returns on their loans because their cost of funding was always higher than larger banks. So they were forced, in a way, to take that risk. And that's where the contagion would occur. For the rest of the world, I would argue is rather limited. And the reason why I say that is that, yes, maybe high yield offshore dollar bonds in Hong Kong, but basically, Evergrande for the onshore market is still a rather limited shock, which would then not pass on through to the rest of the world, in my opinion. So it's basically a real estate type contagion that we should be discussing here. Developers in China.
Alicia, is Evergrande too big to fail?
Absolutely, 300 billion. You said it right there. But why is it too big to fail? Because Evergrande's model is literally China's real estate developers' model. That's the point, especially for private developers. So we've made some calculations at Natixis Research looking into the differences among SOE, state-owned developers and private. And what we see is that on pre-sales is very obvious. They're much further ahead in terms of their use of funding. And then, if you know, the regulatory landscape in China has certainly worsened dramatically because of these 3 red lines that have been imposed on developers. Only 17% of private developers fulfill all of the criteria not to trespass the 3 red lines. So in other words, the government has to either lift these red lines or do something about it. It just cannot let all of these developers go. So that's why I think action will be taken indeed.
How concerned are you about financial instability in China?
Well, as I said, following my line of action on what's going to happen, what I think is going to happen, there won't be financial stability immediately because the problem is going to be covered. Just think of China Fortune Land. So basically, you will find a Samaritan, Ping An, maybe not necessarily their wish, but certainly their action. Yeah, Ping An is supporting. We will have a few Ping Ans because one might not be enough for Evergrande by cutting it off in pieces. Is this good for financial stability? Yes, in the short run, yes, because we won't have an immediate shock to the transmission channel, banks, and maybe even bondholders, or of course households. But down the road, it's a problem because you basically put bad apples on good apples. And therefore, the systemic risk basically will be increasing over time.